Hi, and welcome to another episode of Beroe Talks, a series of video sessions where we discuss with industry experts and leaders issues in the MRO supply chain. Every buyer needs to engage with a supplier, not only to get the product that the supplier provides, but also to avail the services that the supplier provides. And in the MRO industry, we have integrators who not only provide the services, but also the products. And as we discussed in previous sessions, these integrators provide value-added services such as inventory management and so on. And for an integrator to successfully implement the strategies that are discussed with the buyer, it is important for the buyer to cooperate with the supplier on certain regards in order to enable the supplier to effectively and successfully implement those services. In fact, if you don't cooperate on some regards, it might lead to increased costs, delays, and possibly redundancies. So as a buyer, you should be knowing the areas of implementation or the parts of the cycle of implementation where your cooperation is needed so that the supplier can do a good job. And who else to discuss this with apart from someone who has already been in the implementation part of the industry. So today I've invited Brian Geiger, who is a supply chain consultant and also integrated service implementation in charge at the Wolseley Industrial Group. He has been working in this field for more than 5 years and has worked with clients from the defense, healthcare, and the pharmaceutical space. Brian, it is an absolute honor to have you with us today, and thank you for taking time to talk to us today, Brian.
Thank you very much, Anup. It's a pleasure to participate.
And like I always say, the time zone, Brian is joining us from the Pacific Standard Time, which is, I think, on the other side of the world when you look at it from the Indian Standard Time. So we really appreciate the efforts in getting up and joining us early in the morning, Brian.
Absolutely.
So Brian, correct me if I'm wrong because you're the expert here, but from my understanding on the industry, the implementation cycle is mainly defined by three main legs. I would like to call it the three legs of the tripod because you cannot do one without the other. And what I would say those three things would be is one is a robust project plan, because without the plan you don't have an implementation. And secondly, it would be data collection from the supplier. So the right data is being collected. And thirdly, the communication between the supplier and the buyer in order to get the data. So without collecting data, you don't get the necessary information, and this requires communication, and that helps you get a project plan. So I would say all three are interlinked. So according to your experience, what would you say is the core of an implementation cycle? Have I missed out something, or would you like to just comment on this, Brian?
No, Anup, I think you hit it right on the head. During the RFP and RFI process for an integrated supply program, there's a lot of discussion that goes into what we can do for you and where all the value comes from. But where the rubber really meets the road is during the implementation process. And this is really where the integrator needs to deliver on all those promises and expectations that they've set throughout the course of the project. So I agree that those first three steps that you had mentioned, starting with the defined resource plan, allowing us to very specifically know who each of the stakeholders are for the project, both on the integrator side and on the customer side, a robust project plan, which details all of the key steps and critical paths necessary to keep the implementation moving and on track to go live on time, as well as the efficient and complete collection of data, whether it's through a electronic file review, but most likely supplemented by a physical crib crawl where we're on-site manually collecting data on all the items that are used on a regular basis. So I absolutely agree that those three are probably the top three key elements that buyers need to keep in mind when working with an integrator on implementation. However, to round out the top three, I'd say that there are two more. It's really structured communication, making sure that there's a detailed plan or pre-scheduled meetings both for the internal team and for the external team to make sure that on a weekly basis both sides of the table are on the same page as to what the next steps are and who's accountable for each of those actions. And that's really the way to make sure that the project continues to drive forward. And the last key element that I would say would be a post-implementation survey or follow-up, really to make sure that you're dialoguing with the end users and the stakeholders throughout the plant and throughout the corporate team to make sure that there are no gaps between the as-is or current state with the now future state process.
Okay, so I think the first step is to understand what the implementation cycle is before we try to develop it or make it better, and I think that's what we have done just now. So thanks for that. So now let's try to understand how a buyer can improve their part in the whole process. So maybe if we can go through each one one by one. So what would be the responsibility of the buyer and what would be the responsibility of the supplier in each of these steps? So for example, if you take a robust project plan, does the buyer need to involve in that process? I mean, in that particular step of the implementation?
I would say that when it comes to actually creating the project plan, and this is something we like to do within Microsoft Project because we could track those critical paths, I think that the integrator is absolutely taking the lead on the vast majority of the work. However, once we put together the project plan, we want to make sure that we're getting in front of the customer, reviewing it with them, and making sure that they're in agreement with the process that we've put in place. Because at the end of the day, we're going to depend on them when it comes to gathering resources and gathering data from the customer side.
Okay, so what are the parts of the implementation which is more on the supplier's responsibility than compared to the buyers? Because if I'm a buyer, I would want to know in which parts of this implementation do I really need to involve, because I may not have the time and the resources to be proactively involving in the whole part of it. So perhaps, yes, communication 100%. Without communication, we don't have any plausible output. So what would you say is the parts of the cycle where the buyer needs to keep an alert? For example, communication, perhaps. So what would it be for the resource planning or the other aspects of implementation?
So that's a good question, and I think that again, I believe that the integrator is really driving the work in all of the different 5 elements, but we really see integrated supply as a partnership and a lasting relationship with our customers. So unfortunately, the customer on the buyer side needs to be involved throughout all of the steps. Just their involvement can be limited to maybe 20 to 30 minutes a day, rather than the integrator who's spending full time working on these projects. Especially, so at first we talk about having a defined resource plan, and the benefit there is that you're not identifying a single associate from the customer side who's going to be doing all the work. You're able to identify key stakeholders from each of the different functional departments, and that way when there's a finance question, you could go over and talk to the controller. When there's a question about engineering specifications or inspections and quarantine of materials, then we could go talk to the quality manager or to the engineering manager. So it's really about setting that resource plan and defining who the stakeholders are so that the integrator doesn't have to bother the buyer with the little details. They know exactly who to go speak to within the plant to get the information they need to continue to push the project forward.
Okay. Let me put it this way. If I were to break the implementation cycle to these 5 steps, like we just discussed, would you say that there are some steps that are more crucial on the buyer's side in terms of his corporation that results in the success of the implementation? So do you think that there are some steps that are more important and some steps that are less important when the buyer looks at it, so that, like for example, if I was going to tell the buyer, listen, you need to focus on communication more than you focus on the other aspects from your part, because obviously it's a joint venture, but then some responsibilities of the implementations are solely on the suppliers. So would you be able to differentiate these steps in terms of relevance to the buyer's time spent with the supplier?
Sure. So if we start at the beginning, I'd say that having the defined resource plan, that's going to be mainly on the integrator, with the customer basically telling us who those stakeholders are. So not a lot of involvement there, kind of moving past it.
Okay.
The project plan as the second step, that again is probably 90% the integrator putting together the plan based on the different milestones that we have within our implementation checklist. and then working or presenting it to the customer to get their buy-in and approval. So again, probably a 95% split between the integrator and the buyer. Data collection, this is probably the number one area where we need the most involvement from the buyer side of the organization, because we're so dependent on the data that's currently available in terms of product information and specifications, historic usage information and demand, previous purchase price, so that we could benchmark in order for cost savings. And a lot of this data, we could collect through the manual crib crawl process in terms of manufacturer name, manufacturer part number, and description. But when you're looking at some of the more KPI types of data in terms of last purchase price, lead time, fill rate, that kind of information really needs to come out of the customer's system, and that's not something the integrator typically has access to without that assistance.
Okay. You mentioned post-implementation follow-up. So that is, I think, initiated by the supplier, but also requires the cooperation of the buyer, right?
Absolutely.
So I think from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, the data collection and the communication and the follow-up, these are the areas which the buyer would have to focus on the most.
Yes, that's correct.
And in terms of the project plan, it's more of the integrator's responsibility to come up with a plausible idea.
Correct. And at the end of the day, Anup, I would say that it's the integrator's job to lead the buyer through each of these steps as well, since it's the integrator that has the experience and has done the process before.
Okay. So we've established the fact that it's important for the buyer to involve in a couple of stages of the implementation. And I'm sure there are instances where this did not work out in the best possible way, and buyers may not have cooperated because you've been there, done it as an integrator. You've been there at the client site and you've had face-to-face interactions with the buyers. Is there anything in your experience that you can share with us where a lack of cooperation resulted in a possible loss? If not a monetary loss, it could be a loss of time, resource, or even a redundancy in the whole effort that you had done as a supplier.
Yeah, sure. I'd like to say that all of our implementations go perfectly and there's never any hitches in terms of communication or timelines, but as you know, with all projects, you run into hiccups or bumps in the road occasionally. One example that comes to mind is we were working with a customer up in the Northeast that had it was a multi-site implementation, and the main site followed our direction or our suggestion, and they assigned a full-time program champion to help work with our implementation team to get the project up and running. And in that case, we were able to sit down with them on a daily basis and really make sure that we were understanding all the key stress points that they were facing today and where are the areas that they needed the most improvement. And in doing so, we were able to deliver on their needs. At the same time, however, they had a second site that was about a 3 to 4 hour drive away, and that was more of a satellite location, so they didn't have the same support or the same communication with the corporate team that the main plant did. And what we came to find out is that throughout the implementation process, we were really being challenged at different points and different milestones throughout the implementation. And after the implementation, we went ahead with our post-implementation follow-up survey, where we send a questionnaire to each of the end users and all the stakeholders to find out if all the gaps have been addressed or if there's anything that we need to spend some more time on or additional training for the end user. And what we found out from the survey response was that the customer, the end users, the guys actually running the machines, really weren't aware of the value that the integrator was bringing or why the corporation decided to go with an integrator rather than continuing to manage the process in-house. So what we found was that because that value proposition that we had originally sold to their corporate team and that their corporate team was well aware of, that was never communicated down to the end users or even down to the supervisors at the plant level. So they were giving us some pushback and some opposition to a lot of the key initiatives that we were trying to drive. And the way that we ended up getting around this or overcoming it is we started to disseminate all of the key performance indicators and our monthly metric pitch outs, and starting to share those with the plant team and with the end users, which is something we normally don't do. And once we were able to communicate that value down to the end users, we saw a change in their attitude, and they were more willing to support us in our initiatives because they knew ultimately we're not here to push them out or make their life harder or change their jobs. We're here to actually assist them in doing their job better, more efficiently, for at a lower cost.
Okay, so I think the main thing you said was the mindset of the buyer, which was maybe not best suited for the scenario that they're in. But can you give me maybe let me put it this way. What are the two main challenges that you face when you implement a strategy at your client side in terms of the buyer's lack of cooperation, or maybe perhaps the lack of ideas? So what are the two biggest challenges that you face in implementation when you look at it from a point of a supplier looking at the buyer's cooperation?
Sure. So I would say that for one, bad communication or skipping over passing down that value proposition to the end users, I think it creates some tension between the buyer's organization and the supplier's organization, because the buyers start to get worried about their responsibilities and where the overlap is. The second part that probably gets affected is the completeness of the data that we use for the uploads and for the interface processes. And what we've seen is that when there's a high level of participation and engagement from the customer side, we're able to create a very customized program for that customer. However, when there's not a lot of participation and not a lot of engagement, the program becomes less customized.
So the biggest challenge is communication. Is there anything else that is a problem apart from communication?
Sure, and a big piece of that is the access to data. A lot of times companies today just do not have the data necessary to benchmark last purchase price or to truly understand the demand patterns. But at the same time, that's one of the reasons why they're working with an integrator as well. Okay,
so maybe access to data, or perhaps the way it was done in the past. But then, like you said, yeah, probably that's the reason why they talk to you guys. Would you have any advice to the buyers in terms of how they can, I mean, let's not be specific here because we don't want to target anyone, but then if I was a buyer and you were going to work with me tomorrow, and if I was a really chilled out guy, what would you want to tell me so that I can make your life easier?
That's a good question. I would say that the biggest thing is if we could get the customer to buy into the idea that they need to assign a full-time program champion to work with us and help facilitate communication with the overall plant team, I would say that that's the number one takeaway that a buyer could have, is that a single point of contact is absolutely necessary in order to complete an implementation without any hitches and on time and exceeding the expectations laid out by the consultant and the corporate team.
Would you want me to put any processes in place? I mean, yes, I'll assign a single point of contact to engage with you, but is there anything that you want me to do? Let's assume that I'm the buyer and I can do anything in my power to make it better so that I get the best services out of you.
Well, the second part was once we have that main point of contact and we also have the defined list of stakeholders, is really ensuring participation in our weekly 4-blocker communication tools. So what we use is a 4-blocker where each week we meet with the customer team and with our internal team, and we put up a template that shows the accomplishments from the past week, the plans for the upcoming week, items for management attention, and then any potential roadblocks. And by making sure that the customer team is available and engaged in these meetings, we can highlight any potential concerns before they start impacting the timeline or the implementation. So really, having them available and engaged in that dialogue is vital to the success of the implementation.
So to sum it up, the two main things that are expected from a buyer is their time and probably assigning a single point of contact so that they can successfully engage with the supplier. And I think the rest of it would be a cakewalk, because if these two things are there, you would probably have a robust project plan, you would have the correct data is extracted, because the indicators are going to be there at your field. You will have the right timelines that are followed, because there are no hitches. Because if you attend the meetings that talk about the delays and the roadblocks coming ahead, you can solve them in time. So I think it's pretty simple then. You can actually engage with a supplier and get the best out of them if you're able to dedicate the time and assign a single point of contact for the supplier. Am I right, Brian?
Yes, I absolutely agree. It's the integrator who's going to lead you through the project, but there are going to be points where we need buyer involvement in order to make it happen, and I think you hit that right on the head.
So as a buyer, I think the majority of the responsibility would be on the integrator, because as a buyer, you would only need to focus on your time and your resources as a person assigning a single point of contact. And I think the rest of it would be taken up by the integrator in order to make sure that you get the best services out of them. So I think that wraps it up for today. If you have any questions or you want to write to us, you can email me at anup.varghese@beroeinc.com, or you can write to us at info@beroeinc.com, and we will get back to you. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.